Welcome back. President Trump is casting some doubt on the Saudis' explanation for the death of journalist Jamal Khashoggi.
What the Saudis have said about Khashoggi now, are they telling the truth?
Well, you know what, John? I'm going to know very shortly because I have a great group of people in Turkey right now and a great group of people in Saudi Arabia. We will know very soon. We have tremendously talented people that do this stuff very well. They're coming back tonight, tomorrow, and I will know very soon. And I am not satisfied with what I've heard.
Yet he told the Washington Post over the weekend that he would like to see Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, MBS as he's known, to remain in power, calling him a, quote, strong person who truly loves his country. That is in contrast to lawmakers on both sides of the aisle.
The Crown Prince has his fingerprints all over this.
I feel certain that the Crown Prince was involved and that he directed this, and that's why I think we cannot continue to have relations with him.
If he's gone forth and murdered this journalist, he's now crossed the line, and there has to be a punishment and a price paid for that.
Meanwhile, Germany announced it will halt arms sales with Saudi Arabia, but will that encourage allies like the U.S. to do the same? I'm joined now by Rhode Island Senator Jack Reed, the top Democrat on the Senate Armed Services Committee. Senator, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
Do you believe that we should stop our arms sale deal with Saudi Arabia the same way that Germany is doing, the same way that Chancellor Angela Merkel announced today?
I think we should suspend arms sales until we have a full, complete, and thorough investigation that is credible, that is an international investigation, not one conducted by the Saudis or one influenced by the Saudis. And we should, waiting for that, suspend any arms sales. The last arms sale proposal before the Senate was in June of 2017. I voted against it. It was precision-guided munitions because we do have to send a signal to the Saudis that they have to respect international norms.
Do you believe there's any chance that MBS, Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince, did not know about the Khashoggi interrogation and then killing, that he was not involved?
I believe that he was aware of what was going on. The detail is something that should be subject to a careful investigation, but particularly convinced that once the incident took place, he was fully aware of what was going on. And yet, for many, many days, there was total denial, total obfuscation of what went on. So there is a culpability here.
What do you think Congress needs to do here? The president has sent mixed signals on how he's responding to Saudi Arabia. Sometimes he's more skeptical than other times, but he's emphasized over and over again that the U.S. needs this arms deal, and the folks that could be employed by the arms deal don't need to suffer for a killing like this, essentially. What should Congress do independent of the president of the United States?
Well, what we should do after, again, clarifying the facts with a thorough investigation, consider very seriously sanctions. We have the Magnitsky Act, which was passed because of activity in Russia, which we found abhorrent. But we could apply those types of sanctions against culpable individuals in Saudi Arabia. We'd have to look and see who was involved, how far the involvement went up, their leadership levels. But people should be held responsible for this. If we don't, then we're tolerating, which is something which is absolutely hard.
Well, if it goes up to MBS, what would those sanctions look like against him?
Well, sanctions can be imposed upon holdings you have outside of your own country, particularly holdings in the United States. There could be restrictions on travel, lots of factors that could be introduced. But it would send a message, like a powerful message, that we're not going to tolerate this type of behavior.
Rand Paul thinks that he should be replaced. Do you?
I think, again, it helps to have the facts, and we have to get the facts. But if they continue to
If the facts show that he was involved or knew about it, do you think he should be replaced?
If the fact shows he's involved, I think he should go, frankly, because I think the best interest of not only the world community, but of Saudi Arabia would have someone who is an authority that would respect basic norms. And this killing of Khashoggi violates just fundamental norms.
Well, let's talk about the relationship between Saudi Arabia and Donald Trump specifically. Last week, a group of Senate Democrats sent a letter to Donald Trump and his organization, the Trump Organization, seeking a full accounting of any financial ties between the Trump Organization and Saudi Arabia. I presume you have not heard back about that.
I have not heard personally, no, but the president has himself stated how he has sold multiple condominiums and apartments and other real estate to Saudi Arabians over the years and has made quite a bit of money. And so this is a relationship that exists. He's even admitted that.
There's been, again, you're right, apartments sold to the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia in one of Donald Trump's buildings. Donald Trump sold one of his yachts, $20 million, I believe, to a former crown prince of Saudi Arabia. They stay at his D.C. hotel. If Democrats are able to retake control of the House, do you believe there should be investigations into the financial interactions between Donald Trump's organization and Saudi Arabia?
I think that would be something that should be seriously considered and probably pursued. I think the first challenge would be, first, let's get to the bottom of this terrible case with the killing of Khashoggi. And if that points in the direction of involvement and entanglement by anyone else outside of Saudi Arabia, we should look there.
His conflicts of interest, he hasn't divested from his business. There are questions about how much money he has all around the world and how much business he has all around the world and whether or not any of that is influencing his decision making. Are you confident that the President of the United States is making decisions independently of his pocket and in the best interest of the American people when it comes to foreign policy?
Well, he's injected this skepticism by his refusal from the beginning to release his income taxes, by his comments on the campaign trail about how Saudi Arabia he sold properties to them. So I think he owes the American people clarification, a clear, incontestable divulgement of all the facts and information to suggest that there's no involvement. I think still staying technically involved in the Trump operation organization just leads to suspicion, which hurts the ability of the American people to have confidence that every decision is made without any recognition of personal gain or personal profit.
Donald Trump, and another subject, has said that Russia has been in violation of the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, INF, now for quite some time. He's not the first president to have done that. President Obama said that as well, but he is the first president to say that he could withdraw from the INF. Do you think that he should?
I think that would begin to slowly unwind the arms control regime that has been built up over many, many decades that has not reversed the possession of nuclear weapons, but has had a check on them. And then I think we have a START agreement that is going to be negotiated to be renewed, which covers ballistic intercontinental missiles. So I think that's a dangerous step to step away right now. We have the ability to respond to these types of weapons. I hope we don't have to. But I think at this point, the real problem is beginning to slowly undermine an arms control regime that has brought some stability to the international situation over many, many years.
How confident do you feel about the Democrats' chances of retaking the House or potentially the Senate in a couple weeks?
I feel very good. I think the enthusiasm there. I think the issue that is most striking and compelling is the issue of health care. Senator McConnell said last week that he's going to once again try to repeal the Affordable Care Act, which means pre-existing conditions protections for millions of Americans will go away. I think also when you talk to a lot of people about Medicare, Social Security, Medicaid, when, again, Senator McConnell is talking about balancing the budget after the tax cuts produced a tremendous deficit by going after Medicare, Social Security, and Medicaid. I think that's very worrisome to middle-income Americans. They depend upon those programs. And so those are the issues, I think, that people will galvanize and support Democrats.
Senator Jack Reed. Senator, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Hello, YouTubers. If you're watching this, it means you've checked out our channel, so thank you. Now do me a favor, subscribe by clicking on that button down there. Click on any of the videos to watch the latest interviews and highlights from MTP Daily and MSNBC. You can get more Beat the Press content every morning in the First Read newsletter. If you're tired of content that you don't know anything about where it came from, you don't have to have that problem with us. NBC News, MSNBC, MTP, and the Meet the Press mindset right here for you on YouTube. Subscribe now.